Okay. Thanks, everyone. I'm Ruth Long, and I would like to welcome you to our Pathways to Stability Supportive Housing Solutions Forum. This forum is hosted by the League.
What? See you later.
Let's be sure to mute. This is the Pathways to Stability Supportive Housing Solutions, which is hosted by the Affordable Housing Team of the League of Women Voters of Larimer County. And just a couple of housekeeping messages. I do want to remind you to keep yourself on mute unless you're going to be talking, of course. And there will be time for questions at the end, and I'd like to ask you to submit your questions on chat. So that way we can kind of keep moving along, and then we'll get to those questions at the end. I'm sorry that we're going to have to do that, but I know that we'll have a lot of questions. So before we get to our panel, I'd like to introduce Pat Berger, who is the president of the League of Women Voters of Larimer County. And I'll let Pat do a little welcome for us. Pat?
Everybody, thank you for being here. I hope we get more people coming. I don't see a ton on, but thank you so much for being here with the League. I know we're going to have a great conversation about supportive housing. So I will leave it at that. I encourage you to check out our website, lwv-lamercounty.org. We do accept men in addition, and we're nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. So welcome. Thank you. That's good enough.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, and I'll ask each one of them to talk just a little bit about their project. And let's start with Daniel. Daniel Covey is a dedicated social work professional with 20 years of experience in poverty alleviation and innovative housing solutions, holding a master's degree in social work with a specialization in trauma-informed care and a minor in ethnic studies. Daniel brings a strong track record in housing retention and program management. He has been instrumental in launching and operating 2 nationally recognized permanent supportive housing initiatives. And Daniel is the manager of supportive housing at the Fort Collins Housing Catalyst. And Daniel, would you like to just give us a brief rundown on your project and how it got started?
Yes, happy to do that. Hello, good evening, everyone. Glad to be here with you. And thanks, Ruth, for the wonderful introduction. So yeah, I work for Housing Catalyst, and in terms of background on our 2 permanent supportive housing programs, our first program called Red Tail Ponds, it's located on the south side of Fort Collins, kind of near the intersection of College and Harmony. And we opened in March of 2015 in response to our community's recognition that there was a lot of chronic homelessness in our community. And so we really looked around at other communities across the nation. In fact, we visited about 18 other permanent supportive housing programs that were finding good success, and we gathered best practices from those programs and baked them into the recipe, so to speak, at Red Tail Ponds. So I will say when we first opened Red Tail, there was a very strong amount of community pushback. Sometimes people call that NIMBYism or not in my backyard. I can tell you more about that if you like, but we opened up, and I think even our close business neighbors initially thought that this was going to be, they were very fearful about it. And pretty quickly, I think they realized this is basically an apartment building, just like everybody else. So yes, we're housing people that were experiencing homelessness, people with disabilities, and veterans. But again, we're all people. And so pretty quickly, the community realized, this is just an apartment building. So what makes permanent supportive housing special is that we blend affordable housing with supportive services. So we have case management and behavioral health services. We have staff in the building around the clock to respond to residents' needs, and those sorts of things. And so we've found that by providing supportive housing, we've been able to reduce the cost in the community, decreasing the amount of folks that are going to shelters and hospitals and jail systems and things like that. So then 5 years after we opened Redtail Ponds, we opened our second program, Mason Place, and that's located near Horsetooth in College, where the Midtown Arts Center used to be. And so both programs are similar. I think of them as like sibling programs. They both serve the same population and same staffing approach, things like that. So it's been really helpful to have both buildings so we can house 120 people between the two properties. So I think I'll stop there for now, but that's the overview.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Okay, let's go to Morgan Rossow, who is the Resident Services Coordinator for Catholic Charities. And Morgan is a dedicated human service professional who was born and raised in Colorado. Morgan holds a master's degree in social work from CSU, is a licensed clinical social worker and a licensed addiction counselor. So, and Morgan is going to talk to us about St. Valentine's Apartments in Loveland. Morgan?
Yeah. So St. Valentine is a little newer than the Housing Catalyst programs. We just got fully leased up a little over a year ago in Loveland, but we have just a little over 50 units, same, permanent supportive housing model, really focusing on, the most vulnerable, chronically homeless individuals and servicing those folks. It kind of came to fruition just with relationship and communication between our director of development and of course the Loveland Housing Authority, really just talking about, the over 150 plus documented homeless individuals in Loveland that needed permanent solution, that were being serviced by shelters and like Daniel mentioned, jails, hospitals, rehabs, all of the other pieces, but needing a more permanent solution. We have another permanent supportive housing complex in Greeley. It's the Guadalupe Apartments, and and our model with kind of within Catholic Charities shelters and Catholic Charities housing, really just started exploring that permanent supportive housing solution for Loveland. I think it was a long process, right, with city staff, the city council. I think we were really lucky that overall the city supported the vision. I think people saw the need and really supported it. I think we still feel that to this day, whenever we're trying to fill staffing positions or whenever we're looking for volunteers or resource, we see the strength in the community of Loveland and folks really showing up and wanting to be a part of the solution. And so I think that's been a huge blessing for our property and the development of our property. And so then the project closed financially in summer of 2022, then construction finished in late 2023, and then the building was fully leased by early 2024. So we were just wrapping up our first year. We have had recently a lead service provider shift, but I think really just trying to figure out what permanent supportive housing looks like best within our model and our vision and our hopes and all of that. And so I think just really believing in the model and believing in the ability of our residents. I think that's the powerful thing about permanent supportive housing is it really believes that everybody to make life-changing decisions and to find and sustain housing, which is pretty incredible.
Thank you, Morgan. And finally, we have Jeff Fennis. Jeff is the executive director of the Loveland Housing Authority. And Jeff has worked for the Loveland Housing Authority since 2007. Prior to accepting the executive director position in 2018, Jeff held the positions of project manager, housing manager, and director of real estate development. During his tenure on staff, the Housing Authority has created more than 500 affordable housing units in Loveland and surrounding communities, and also created 47 single-family home lots for Habitat for Humanity. The Housing Authority is currently developing 175 single-family home lots for affordable home ownership and has 120 affordable rent units in construction. Prior to joining the Loveland Housing Authority team, Jeff worked as a manufacturing engineer for Hewlett-Packard for 17 years. Jeff, would you like to tell us a little bit more about the EDGE?
Sure. Thank you, Ruth. And you probably all noticed that being an engineer, I don't quite have the same qualifications as Daniel and Morgan, who are real social workers, but we put in a lot of effort. So our EDGE project is a little bit different. And sometimes that works well, sometimes not. And when we get into the questions, we'll talk through that. But it really started, as Morgan said, we enjoy great support from our city council and city staff. And when we built the EDGE, which was 70 units, traditional, LIHTC, affordable housing, we decided to build one 10-unit building specifically for permanent supportive housing. And we didn't get it all right, but we had a whole lot of support from everybody that we work with in the community. And the approach that we took different, and again, for better and for worse, is that rather than having a dedicated building, well, I guess we do, but a dedicated campus, really, like Daniel and Morgan have, we have 10 units integrated into what was originally 70 total units, soon to be a total of 205. The thought being that we could just integrate the supportive housing population, and that would be good for everybody. And it's worked and it's not worked, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Our specific challenge is service delivery. I joke that I'm a reformed engineer, not a case manager, social worker like Daniel and Morgan, but there's a lot of truth to that. We're not staffed with social workers, so we need to rely on partnerships to get those services delivered. And I'll just tie in to St. Valentine real quick. And Morgan was spot on. While we were having conversations with the Loveland community and city council, and I think I even saw Jackie on tonight a little bit earlier. Can we build more? We need more. And yes, everybody understood that we needed more. We were struggling to get it right. And then suddenly Catholic Charities called one day and said, "Hey, would you mind if we came to town?" So would we mind? We'll help you. And it's been a great partnership. And I think we serve the homeless population better through that partnership. And we manage the vouchers. We extended our tax abatement, of course, with city council support, those kinds of things. So we're evolving in trying to get this right. But in the meantime, we serve 10 formerly homeless veterans at a time.
Very good. Thank you,
And then
Jeff.
if I could add one more thing, completely unrelated, but it'll be the most important thing I say all night. When I get the opportunity, I like to tell the League of Women Voters, thank you for the job. Because you all gathered together and really founded the Housing Authority back in, it was either 71 or 72. So without that effort, I may not be here. So thank you.
I didn't know that, but I think it's wonderful. And thanks for just acknowledging that. That's great. Okay. So we have some questions for the panelists to start off with, and then we will take questions from the other participants. And I wanted to say again, if you would put your questions in the chat, and then we will get to those in a bit. And once again, if you haven't muted yourself, if you could mute unless you're going to be talking, I'd really appreciate it. Thanks. So our first question, and I think you'd want to just limit yourself to a couple of minutes on your answers if you can. What are the goals of specific housing and what are the strategies for achieving these goals? What critical services should be included? And let's start with Morgan.
Yeah, I think our goals of supportive housing, right, is to one, reach people where they're at. You know, supportive housing tends to be a low barrier model, meaning that there's not um, a lot of requirements, right? I mean, there's things people have to do in order to get in, but they can be at different journeys in their path, and we're willing to kind of meet them where they're at. And you know, from there then it's to kind of move up in that ability to meet needs, you know. So that first step is really addressing those immediate needs, right? Food, shelter, safety, really addressing that most basic human need. And then once those are met and stabilized, it kind of opens the door to that more complex need. So that sobriety, maybe that stabilizing mental health, the building community, and working towards more than just survival. I think the goal is to encourage growth and stability. But I think the biggest piece is it's at a pace that's personalized and sustainable for each individual. And that can be really tricky because that looks different for every single person. And I think that is the important piece of the model, though, is recognizing that and recognizing that what works for one person maybe doesn't work for the other person. And, you know, and so the need for the services and the ability to kind of assess that on an individual basis is huge. And I think our critical services for sure is kind of pairing two components. It's this accountability component with this support component. And so for us, that looks like services that are offered on site and in the community. And really, you know, it's twofold. It's to decrease the barriers, build engagement, but then teach transferable skills that can be sustainable lifelong. You know, so I think it's a mixture of all of the above. But at St. Valentine, we employ on site a property manager, security, case management, behavioral health support. So for us, that's a clinician, and peer support. And then the site also engages with multiple community partners to meet needs, you know, whether it's food, furniture, employment, you know, lots of community partners play roles in that. Physical health, you know, mobile health clinics, all of those pieces, I think are necessary really in building that support, building that initial response, right? I think that's the biggest piece is it has to be low barrier in the beginning because it's got to be something where you can come into it in crisis or immediately, you know, kind of calming down from crisis and able to access things and slowly learn that independence and build upon those skills and start building greater community and building greater purpose and, you know, and moving beyond just survival.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. Jeff, would you like me to repeat that question or do you have it?
Yeah, I've got it. That's fine.
Okay.
Well, so that's hard to add much to what Morgan had to say because I think she was spot on. A couple things I would add though, um, with the Edge being our first attempt at permanent supportive housing, we all had to learn a lot. And I think the most important thing that I learned is that success for a PSH resident is as simple as they are still housed a year later after they move in. And our core business, core mission will always be the affordable rentals, um, independent living. And it's always success when somebody's able to move in to one of those units. stabilize and overcome whatever challenges they're having. And when they move on, maybe into a habitat home, or they get another job and can move into a market rate unit. The PSH units I see as 1 or 2 steps beyond that. And it's absolutely critical that without a safe, stable roof over your head, not much else can happen. You're just living in crisis, maybe on the streets or in a shelter. When you have that roof and then the wraparound services that PSH brings, then Morgan said it a couple times. We're dealing with unique individuals with unique challenges that need specialized services to address their needs. It might be mental health, it might be who knows what, it might be medical, it might be substance abuse, it might be traditional counseling. Anyway, I could go on and on. There's probably 50 different examples. And for us, those services are our biggest challenge. We partner with the VA, Veterans Administration, for the case management. They're resource constrained like everybody else. Morgan rattled off a whole host of staff that they have on site. We don't have the funding for that with only 10 units. And so we've got the VA that has a small presence. They're out at least once a week meeting with folks. And then we have our traditional property management staff that works this in. And we have Aspire, our service-oriented service-oriented 501c3. Wow, that's a mouthful tonight. That serves all of our residents. That helps out, but it's not the specific tailored permanent supportive housing. And so we rely on other partners, such as Touchstone Mental Health, is probably the best example. And so I think what's important for anybody to be successful is get somebody under that stable roof, but then be able to provide the services. Nothing happens without the roof, but without those services, nothing else happens either. The services have to be there.
Right. Thank you, Jeff. And Daniel.
Well, Morgan and Jeff covered it really well. So I agree with everything they said. Somebody asked me recently, what is the secret sauce to permanent supportive housing? And at first, I thought about kind of the building blocks, which Morgan mentioned, but harm reduction, housing first, and trauma-informed care are kind of the like underpinnings of our program. And then I thought a little bit more, is that like really the secret sauce? And I really came to the belief that compassionate accountability is really the approach, is what makes this special and makes it successful. And I think Jeff said something like that too. And so our goal is to, support people, as you've heard before, to keep their housing, to work with them. And like, I think it's important to call that out, that sometimes that's really challenging. Sometimes folks live with us who haven't lived in an apartment for a long time, are struggling with lots of interpersonal challenges, difficult trauma history, mental health, substance use, all these layers. And then, they're offered this apartment, and I think it's tempting to look at this and be like, oh, people escape homelessness, now they have a roof over their head and electricity and water, and isn't everything just grand? Well, yes, those are great things. And the transition into an apartment where you have a lease and neighbors and all these rules and expectations and visitor guidelines, all this is a lot. It makes for a difficult transition. Furthermore, to a point that Morgan said, I think when people are in the throes of homelessness, there's this fight for survival. But then when they're move into housing, often it's quiet and maybe even too quiet, and people struggle with this. And so the transition out of homelessness, I think, is much more difficult than many people realize. And so that's why I think you're hearing kind of the answer that Morgan and Jeff are offering, which is, all right, it's about how do we meet this person where they're at, understand their needs, and support this, initial transition out of homelessness and then beyond, to create the life that makes sense for them.
Good. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to all of you. And And the next question is, discuss the difference between the housing first and treatment first models. What are the pros and cons? And let's start with Jeff.
Sure. So you let me go first on the most social worker oriented question.
Oh,
No, that's great. So here's my take on it. Everything I've learned in the last 9 or 10 years. So the treatment first model is, in my mind, the traditional model of you work with a homeless individual, find them where they are, and help them overcome their issues while they're still living on the street. In the traditional thought was, and these are my words, you had to earn the housing by making progress, overcoming your challenges. With the housing first model, it's exactly that. Housing first, all three of us just talked about it. Get somebody in under a safe, stable roof, and then started addressing the issues. And even though I've said that we have struggled a little bit with the only 10 units in lack of scale, I believe housing first is the model. I've seen it work. Um, it doesn't always work, but a lot of things in life don't always work the first time. Um, and it may not be a perfect model, but it's the best model out there because you get somebody off the street and safe first and out of immediate day-to-day crisis, life-threatening threats out on the street. They're removed from that, and then after hopefully a stability period, Daniel did a good job of explaining that it can be a culture shock to go from the wild streets to living in a quiet apartment. But then you can start addressing the other needs beyond just the very most basic.
mhm. Okay, thank you. Daniel, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. Jeff said that well. The housing first model, I think, is really a best practice. And there's a gentleman who I think is credited for starting housing first. His name is Dr. Sam Sembris. He's a very approachable, real down to earth guy. And he started this in New York, and he mostly did scattered site, which is, when people are interspersed, kind of like Jeff was talking about, in the community. But this housing first model, I think he started in the 90s. And since then, I think pretty much everybody in the field has recognized that this is the model. And the treatment first or housing readiness model is another way to say that. Just doesn't make sense. If you're trying to work with somebody who's struggling with all this trauma and addictions and they're living under a bridge, it makes no sense to say, well, you got to get your ducks in a row before we'll work with you. We've seen great success with taking folks who are in active crisis, inviting them into a place, into an apartment, and with the stability of housing under their feet, like Jeff was saying, they can start to work on some of those issues that led to that homelessness. And what we see is just by having housing, before you even have some of the magic of supportive housing in terms of the meaningful connections with others and the support and case management, before any of that, because people are not fighting for survival, a lot of those coping mechanisms are not needed. So drinking heavily, it's not needed as much. Often we'll see a reduction in people's drinking just because they now are safe. So I'm a super big believer in housing first. And sometimes I think when folks who are not in the field hear the term housing first, they kind of think maybe this is a free for all. There's no rules. You just, invite them in and it's a, big chaotic party. And I think it's important to say that, permanent supportive housing is a very structured form of way to address homelessness. We have a lease agreement. There's many community rules. There's a reason that we have 24/7 staffing. And part of that's support, but part of that is accountability. We're working with people to make sure they follow the community expectations. So I guess I just wanted to call that out.
Great. And Morgan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with Jeff and Daniel. I think another piece of that, the housing first versus this kind of treatment first concept, is that services and engagement in service is voluntary. And I think, I mean, I know I can only speak for myself, but for myself, when I get the choice on if I want to do something or not, I'm more committed to what I choose. You know, I think that you see fewer dropout rates, fewer you know, this power struggle dynamic. Like, this is a choice. People are choosing to make the changes that they want to make. They're not being forced to make these changes. And oftentimes those changes that are made then are more sustainable because you're choosing it for yourself. You're not doing it because someone told you you had to, or that, or you would lose your, you know, housing, or they're not telling you that you have to change this stuff. Our residents are choosing to make changes and choosing to improve their life. And overall, it's that stability piece, that long term. You know, we're really investing in folks for the long term. You know, it's not the immediate forced compliance kind of stuff. It's, we believe in you. We believe in your capacity. We believe that you want to live and create a life for yourself. And we want to help support you in that. And we recognize that that comes with some of those challenges that we were talking about, right? Like, you know, people think that it's just a big party free for all. Sometimes it is, right? And the accountability piece comes in. You know, that's how we learn as humans. A basic learning is from making mistakes and sometimes getting consequences from those mistakes. You know, the housing first model isn't there to protect people from those consequences, but it's to support them and to teach them how to work with that. You know, how do you get a consequence and work through it? How do you build those skills to do it differently in the future versus being in a model where you're forced to comply to get basic needs met, you know, and if you don't comply, you know, the result is dire. You know, I think it's this choice component, which is powerful. I think it's powerful in lifelong transformation. You know, we're not for the immediate, we're for lifelong. And then I think the other piece is just oh, I lost my train of thought. Um, um, that housing should be earned, right? Like, sometimes we get stuck in this power struggle of housing should be earned, and housing is, I mean, a right, and you know, it's something that people deserve, and that's how you move up in the world. You deserve nicer housing the harder you work, that pull yourself up from your bootstraps model. And the reality is, even chronically homeless folks, they find ways to get housing, you know, and it's expensive and it's taxing on society, you know, jails and emergency rooms and all of those pieces. I mean, they're finding ways to get housed anyway, right? You know, and so why not be a place with dignity and respect and belief? I think that's the foundation for the ability to make change and the ability to create the life that you want.
Great. Thank you, Morgan. Okay, our next question. Is supportive housing cost effective? Is there enough supportive housing available to meet the needs in Larimer County? And I'm going to start with Daniel this time.
What a good question. Yes, I think supportive housing is very much cost effective. There's been a number of studies done throughout the country to analyze basically whether it's cheaper to just allow people to experience homelessness. And just like, you know, Morgan was just saying, people bounce off these highly expensive services, jails, you know, EMS, hospitals, treatment centers, and that is not a long-term sustainable plan. It's also very expensive. And so I think every single one of the communities that did this cost analysis found that by providing housing with minimal supportive services, that it's more cost effective. And I can't help but add, and, you know, the human element, the human dignity piece is enormous in my head. But I think, you know, the fact that supportive housing is both, it's cost effective and it's a more dignified housing arrangement, I think is a very powerful argument. Is there enough? No, although I think, in my opinion, sometimes people come to Red Tail Ponds or Mason Place and they make a comment like, this is so amazing, we need like 100 more. And yes, there's a way in which that would be great. But I think really as a community, we're getting wiser, and the goal is really to have a spectrum of different housing solutions to meet a spectrum of different needs. Not everybody needs supportive housing, and really to call it what it is, permanent supportive housing, I think, is the most expensive solution to homelessness. And so for people who have the highest needs, that is appropriate. But there's people who don't need this level of support. They might need some short-term case management or rental assistance. We want to match the level of need. And so I think, yes, we could use more supportive housing, but I think really as a community, we're getting better at identifying what is the correct level of need and then dedicating those resources.
Good. Morgan, what are your thoughts? Morgan, you need to unmute.
Thank you. I totally agree with what Daniel was saying. I think the need piece, are we ever struggling to get new residents? No, there's always a list that supersedes our amount of space. But I do agree that, it is that continuum piece. I think we'll talk about it a little more when we talk about kind of the shelters versus affordable or permanent supportive housing. But, it is, there's different needs. It definitely meets a need. Is it expensive? Yeah. Does it take talent in making sure that services are appropriate and enough, but also weighing, making sure that it's not too much, because then it kind of tips that scale of being too expensive. It is a process for sure. But I do think that it definitely meets a need, and a simple Google search alone will tell you, right? Like if you're comparing permanent supportive housing to jail alone, right? Annual costs can be upwards of $80,000 for someone in a jail, versus permanent supportive housing, they say annually is about $13,000 or $14,000 to have someone, so that's a big swing of finances, so there's lots of room to figure out the trial and error with services, and for money to kind of be figured out for it to meet jail alone. And we're not looking at emergency rooms, all of these other systems, police calls, all these other systems that kind of get overburdened or tasked with some of this response. Some of those that are less tangible. And then you're not looking at the lifelong piece. I think that these other systems they're all temporary solutions, right? They serve a very temporary need, and they're not a permanent solution. I think the hope for permanent supportive housing is that it can either be that safety net or provide steps towards another safety net, right? Like, so the joy is it's not time limited for some of our most acute needs folks. It may be, more lifelong. It may be longer, heavier support. But for a good chunk of our folks, it's just a step forward. It's a stabilization, it's a skill building, it's community building, resource building, all of that, to be able to move on to other places, whether it's Section 8, with fewer services, or tax credit kind of stuff, or even market rate. I think that it is that continuum, and gives people the ability to move forward, just depending on skill and where they're at.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Jeff.
All right. So what I have to add is there's plenty of studies out there that show that for a community, no doubt, housing first models are more cost effective than having folks on the street, because they're not taxing those other resources, whether it's police or emergency room. The challenge that I see, and I'm jumping ahead to the very last question, is that while it costs less to a community, those savings that are realized where the services are no longer needed, to my knowledge, have never really been captured and redirected to permanent supportive housing. If that makes sense. If the emergency room saves, I'm making up numbers here, these may not be right in Loveland, but saves $500,000 a year because St. Valentine opened up and we took people off the street, that $500,000 is not provided back to PSH. And so while there is that savings somewhere in the community, it doesn't go to direct the services that provided that
Right.
saving. And likewise, I can't imagine the backlash if any community tried to defund the jail or the police department because of less need, and we're going to direct it to permanent supportive housing. It'd be a tough sell, but I strongly believe that's what's missing, is that the savings that are realized are going lots of places, but they're not going back to PSH to support it. And so then the providers are left annually to try to figure out how to keep it funded, keep it going. So that's for that piece of it. That's probably the most important thing I have to say. And then, is there enough supportive housing? Anecdotally, I would say not quite. Both Daniel and Morgan did a great job of articulating the need for a continuum of housing. It's one of my favorite slides that I stole from the Division of Housing that I use in my own PowerPoints, but it starts with somebody on the street moving to a shelter, and you go all the way through, and you finally get to market rate. And for any healthy community, you need enough of all those different types of housing so that you don't overtax one or the other. Ideally, will we ever get there? No. But specifically for supportive housing, I believe there's a need for a little bit more, but we're at that point that we need to be very diligent in our due diligence. It's getting late. I'm using the same word twice in a sentence, but we need to do our homework before we build more and make sure we get the number of units right and we get it located right. But happy to report. Maybe we can talk about that. And then the last thing I'll say for I'm more tuned into veteran homelessness because that's who we happen to serve. And around that topic, President Obama had challenged the U.S. to end veteran homelessness. I think by the time he left office, I can't remember the year. And there's been times that we've come close to functional zero. There's always movement in and out, which is another indicator that maybe we're getting close to having the right number in northern Colorado. But I don't know. I'm just talking in circles now. I'm probably not really answering the question. But I think we're fortunate that we're to the point that we need to seriously consider where and if we build more,
Okay.
which is a good thing. It means we've made a lot of progress in the last 15 years.
Yeah, obviously we have. Okay, let's go to the next question. How do supportive housing operations interact with shelter operations? And let's start with Morgan this time.
Yeah, I think, when you look at supportive housing versus shelters, they work in the same continuum. I think they're there to serve different needs, right? I think when you look at a shelter, their main focus is temporary emergency accommodation, right? It's to keep people out of unsafe, dangerous conditions. And it's a crisis response. It's immediate survival. It's congregate living. It's just the basics, the bare minimum basics of how do we get people out of immediate danger and provide basic services. I think where supportive housing kind of comes in is it does have that permanent component, right? And it comes with, those shelters are starting to come with more supportive services. Permanent supportive housing, it's built in and a piece of what it is. It's to really help and focus on ending homelessness for an individual. So versus immediate survival, crisis response, people kind of go in and out of shelters. They, address different needs at different times. Permanent supportive housing, the goal is to end homelessness for someone, to give them the skills to to maintain housing stability, whether that's staying in permanent supportive housing, moving on from supportive housing. It really, the intent is to end homelessness and to work with those complex needs. Our shelters, I can only speak to Catholic Charities shelters, we work on staffing, case managers, and some clinical support, but it's not necessarily the place to meet complex needs, especially when it comes to mental health, disabilities, substance use. It's congregate living. The safety component isn't fully there. It's not, there's so many complex pieces involved. It can start for sure, but I don't know that it's the stability that's needed to address really complex needs, and that's the piece where permanent supportive housing really steps in, and serves as it has more resource to address those complex needs and more natural kind of stability, right? Folks have kind of increased privacy. They have increased self-determination. They have increased accountability sometimes, right? It's still low barrier, but increased about accountability. They need to follow a lease. They have to follow certain rules. They're expected to do certain pieces. So I think that's basically, I feel Jeff, I'm starting to ramble.
Thanks, Morgan. And let's go to Jeff.
Sure. So day to day, honestly, our staff does not have a lot of interaction with the shelters, and I think the best perspective I can give on this is back to that continuum of housing, that we're the next stop after a shelter. Unlike our affordable units that we work off of a wait list, our PSH residents come to us through the continuum of care. And that group refers them to us, the same as for Morgan and Daniel, based on need and the right fit that Daniel mentioned earlier. And so I see that interaction as more being the next stop on the continuum than really a working relationship, because they're referred to us. Having
Okay.
said that, of course, the housing authority is supportive of shelter projects, shelter needs. Um, Loveland, as an example, needs a shelter to house our homeless that don't yet have access to permanent supportive housing. It's that first stop in the continuum, and without that first stop, the continuum's already broken, in my opinion.
Okay, Daniel.
Honestly, I don't have a whole lot more to add. I think Morgan and Jeff summed it up really nicely.
Okay, all righty. I have a question for one of you, whoever, on that. You've talked about the continuum, and if shelter operations are at one end and permanent supportive housing on the other, what's in between? Is there anything?
I don't know that it's necessarily shelter on one end and permanent supportive housing on the other. I think they
Okay.
coexist to some extent, right? It's kind of, they meet different needs. And so there's some folks who utilize shelter services who may never need permanent supportive housing, right? They need a
Right.
temporary solution, and have skills already existing to get back onto their feet and to engage services and stuff like that. I think permanent supportive housing kind of can be that piece where sometimes shelters can't reach those folks, right? Like we have residents who have been homeless, living on the streets, for 10, 15 years, and have they at one point maybe accessed shelter services? Yes, but shelter services they're not meant to be a long-term solution, one, but they weren't the solution that worked for them, so I think it's another piece in it. Shelters can meet immediate need, where, right, permanent supportive housing, it takes process to get into, and so shelters kind of meet that immediate need, and then depending on where your needs are, you know where your needs for support and service are. You know, you have permanent supportive housing, you maybe have Section 8 housing or tax credit housing, and then you have market rate housing. They all kind of exist on the same, they run parallel to each other. You know, it just depends on need, which kind of direction you go.
Ruth,
Okay,
would you mind if I shared a PowerPoint slide real quick?
I think that'd be okay.
Let's see if I can get it right. Can you all see that?
Uh-huh, yes.
So this is the continuum, and I can't take too much
Oh.
credit for it. The basic idea I borrowed from the Division of Housing, but I liked it enough that I've incorporated it. So if you start at the top left, somebody in a homeless shelter, maybe moving into transitional housing, which is exactly that. It's intended to be short term, but get you off the street, but not with intentional services like
Right.
permanent supportive housing. And then hopefully moving into permanent supportive housing if a lot of things go right, then moving into affordable rental housing. And the bright green happens to be where the housing authority mostly operates. And as Morgan mentioned, those products, there's a number of products within that. There's Section 8 vouchers, there's low-income housing, tax credit housing, um, there's other forms of rental assistance through different agencies. But then, if everything goes right there, hopefully folks would have the opportunity to either move into affordable home ownership or maybe even market rate rental or market rate home ownership. So we could add a little more detail in here, but that's the basic continuum that you would hope somebody would be able to follow through. And for permanent supportive housing, I mentioned it when I answered one of the questions, that if that housing suddenly didn't exist, then that continuum in my mind is broken because that option is not there for the folks in a homeless shelter or transitional housing. That's a huge step to go from there into really any other housing, but even our affordable housing, that's a big jump without
Yeah.
having the permanent supportive housing first.
Mhm.
Those services are just critical.
Thank you, Jeff. That really clarifies a lot for me. I appreciate that.
Now let's see if I can figure out how to unshare.
How to get us
There,
back.
okay.
There you go. Good job. Okay. Daniel, did you have anything to add?
I think that maybe a little bit more discussion about the continuum of care might be helpful. I saw that there was a question from, I think, Helen Goody in the chat about how people come to live live with us. And so I'm happy to just briefly describe that there's a continuum of care, which is essentially a region. And in our region, it is partnership between Larimer and Weld County. And essentially, the goal is to create a no wrong door system where all of the homeless service providers work together such that anyone experiencing homelessness can interact with any of the service providers. And they get on a shared list, one community-based list for people experiencing homelessness. And then that is to get on that list, they do an evaluation of people's needs and vulnerability. And so then that list is prioritized based on people's needs and vulnerability. And so when they have an opening at St. Valentine's or the Edge or one of our properties, we notify our partners in the continuum of care and let them know that we have an opening and that they identify somebody who's appropriate for our level of care. And so that's, I think, just it's good to be aware, and I hope that answers your question a little bit, Helen. But in terms of like how we cooperate with the shelters, often we're getting referrals from people who are living at the shelter. And so we work with staff there who are, we have a shared goal to help house that person. We might go over to Catholic Charities, help them complete paperwork, answer questions, but we're all working together to, support this person to exit the homelessness system and sign their lease and have a home.
That is great. Thank you, Daniel. That really helps too, to kind of build the picture of what this process looks like. Okay, the next question, and this is our last question. What do you see as the key challenges for supportive housing going forward? And let's see, I can't remember where I started last time. So, Jeff, do you want to take it?
Sure. It's funding.
Ah,
Funding, hands down, is the biggest challenge.
okay.
No different than our independent living units. We know that the cost to build a new unit is going to be in the low 300,000s. That by using the low income housing tax credit program, which all three of our programs we're talking about tonight were funded, at least in part, that way. We can figure that out. But then the services and the expenses around that are perennially difficult to be able to fund the right amount of staff to provide the services that are needed. And this may sound political, and I don't mean to get political, but to me, somebody tonight used the word compassion. And we need compassion in the community to understand that the funding that I mentioned about, it needs to be redirected. That if we're really as a community going to serve these folks, then let's capture those savings and fund the services that are needed and have that solid continuum and treat people with compassion where they're at. And everybody needs support. It just comes in different levels. The need comes in different levels. So it's funding. And I could have just said that, but
Thanks, Jeff. How about you, Daniel? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll add to the funding concern, and then I'll try to talk about a couple others. But I do think that the current administration's changes to how they're just sending out funding, I think it's really created a lot of fear in the supportive housing community, particularly around so there's continuum of care funding. And so a big way that we are paying for the supportive services side of our work is through this continuum of care grant that we have. So like Red Tail Ponds gets close to $400,000 of supportive services funding. And really, we could not do this work without that. If we lost that, we would have to move to just doing, affordable housing. Like we just could not do it. And so right now with that being threatened, as well as, the changes in Medicaid and a lot of the threats to Medicaid, it really feels like there's a lot of threats to the funding that we depend on. So anyway, I don't want to harp on that too long. But there's a lot of, challenges associated with doing this work. It is not easy work for staff. And so, supporting the staff, avoiding burnout. Many of the staff that come are early career and they're excited to learn, but it's kind of a challenge sometimes. So, staffing can be a tricky thing. I could go on about challenges, but why don't I stop there and let Morgan take it?
Hey, Morgan.
I think, I have to echo the funding piece is probably our biggest challenge, and especially when we're looking at trying to create a model that's sustainable for years to come. And questioning what that'll look like. I think that is the biggest challenge. But I think the other piece is really kind of a community engagement piece too. I think I mentioned that earlier. We were really lucky that the city of Loveland has a heart for some of these services and wants to be a part of it and is proud of it. I think it's continuing to expand that education piece. It's easy to point out cost savings, but if people don't see it and live it, they don't see the how piece. You can see the numbers and the sense, but I think spending a day at properties, hearing stories, meeting people, that piece, that community engagement piece is so powerful. And I think, I like to believe that if people saw the good work and the changes and the people that we work with, and the hopefulness and the ability, it would change the perception of what it means to be unhoused. It would change a lot of things in our world, just that community engagement, that collective community compassion. I think that in a more global sense is something that we are struggling with collectively. And I think that building that back up, I think we have a lot of people who want it, who need it, who believe in it. I think if we can build that back up, I think that pushes a lot of these funding initiatives, these pieces forward. I think, the fact that we have 30 people on this call alone, I mean, that's what's going to continue to drive stuff forward. And so hopefully continuing your guys' work to reach out to more people and stir that passion in people, because it's the movers and the shakers, that is a challenge that we have. People don't understand it. They think it's a low barrier, low accountability method that we're just giving people who are often perceived as undeserving, brand new housing that they can just take advantage of and squander. And, they don't understand that it's so much bigger than that. And is doing things, moving things forward and making a change.
Hey, thank you. Thank you to all of you. Well, that's the end of our questions, but we do have some questions in the chat, and I'm going to let Trish tell us, ask those questions.
And before I go to the first question, I'm going to kind of hook on to something that Morgan said, to give a shout out to two of our city leaders that are with us tonight that were strong supporters of the Valentine project here in Loveland. We have Mayor Jackie Marsh with us, who was with that project from the get-go, and newly elected council member Jennifer Swanty, who has been a strong housing voice in our community for many years. So just know that that partnership is still very strong, Morgan. So the first question we've got here, given that transportation to other support organizations is often time consuming, how important is it to have supportive housing near these other organizations?
Who would like to take that one?
I'm happy to start.
Okay.
I think that that's a great question, and it's very helpful if the distance to other, organizations, but also just, grocery stores and all the things that all of us need. It's helpful if that's close. One thing that I think we've been intentional about is to avoid like poverty concentration. So not having all of the services and all the housing all in the same place. So if you're familiar with Red Tail Ponds, we intentionally built Red Tail Ponds on the south side of Fort Collins. And when we suggested that, a lot of people said, but all the services are on the north side. Why don't you build over there? And I think a lot of our residents actually really appreciate a little bit of distance. So they can still jump on the bus. They can still go, access services if they need. And we do try to find other supports with transportation through partnerships and, but at the end of the day, I just wanted to say there's value in being close to services, and there's also some value in having a little distance.
Great. Morgan or Jeff, either one of you want to answer that?
Yeah, I would echo that. And I would say, I think that that's where the power in having stuff on site and bridging the gap to off-site stuff really happens too. I think if you can have some of those most basic, most critical services on site, it really helps bridge that. Because I do think it is important. We want folks to be members of their community, and that includes accessing community services in the community, and I think that sometimes you just need that initial support and that initial skill development to be able to expand and reach that stuff. I think that that's a huge piece. Yes, is it helpful if that stuff's next door? For sure, but we also want to make sure that it's accessible for the greater community too. That it's not just a need that's held by permanent supportive housing residents, especially when we're thinking about food banks, community mental health centers, you know, all of that kind of stuff. The need is community wide.
Jeff, how about you?
The only thing I would add to that is, again, we're dealing with unique individuals, and just like every other issue, their transportation issues are different. And so there isn't a one size fits all answer. And so the way we've addressed that is we've got different options. We're close to the bus route, City of Loveland. Great example of how they worked with us and put a bus stop really close to our campus. Leadership Loveland, probably about 10 years ago, that graduating class helped us fundraise for a van. So we've got that option to get folks where they need to go. But we really like it when our partners come on the property. And a lot of times they're, Summerstone's a good example. They're able to serve our independent living residents as well, because those needs are not just unique to permanent supportive housing individuals. So yeah, no one size fits all. Transportation is important, but there's unique answers for different households.
Right. Thanks. Okay, Trish, is there another question?
This is more of a comment, but it's an endorsement for Housing First is a documentary entitled Beyond the Bridge, A Solution to Homelessness. This person, Mary Colts, saw it at the Aurora campus in Denver last week, sponsored by the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. The film will be brought to the Greeley campus in the fall. Highly recommend seeing it. Milwaukee and Houston are featured success stories. Will also be available on streaming apps at some point. So just FYI. Thanks for sharing that, Mary. And I think, Daniel, you addressed Helen's question on the process of getting into a residence. Am I correct? Okay. Then the next one is, how does PSH interact with an individual with case management services through Foothills Gateway and who is on a Medicaid waiver?
See, Morgan, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, you know, I think that so we're constantly working with different providers and different kind of case management stuff. You know, thinking of St. Valentine alone, we do have folks who are on waivers and get services through Foothills Gateway. I think PSH sometimes is that beginning stage, and so sometimes it is establishing that waiver, establishing that connection, helping identify the breakthrough for the barriers of accessing those services. But we definitely are always encouraging folks, how do we get you into sustainable services? You know, we're often kind of that warm handoff for those services, and Foothills Gateway is definitely a major provider in some of our community-based service.
Daniel, do you have anything to add?
Not much. I mean, I think Foothills Gateway has stepped up in terms of their role with the county, and so they're able to assess people for like in-home services and long-term Medicaid, and so that's a great asset for people who need that. But yeah, I agree with everything Morgan said.
Okay. And Jeff, any thoughts?
I really can't comment on that specific question. Just the unique nature of the residents we serve being veterans. We've never interacted with Foothills Gateway.
Right. Okay.
You know,
Trish.
those Medicaid waivers are, you know, they're usually functionally dependent. And so it really is specific need dependent, you know, so they usually come with some sort of functional assessment to determine where the need is and what that level of service looks like. And so that's not something that is necessarily accessible for all of our residents.
Right. Okay, Trish.
All right, the last one I see here is from Pat, and everyone may be able to, I won't read this whole thing, Pat, but it's, I'm going to start with the beginning and the end. Can you share any analysis of how people end up needing housing? And so what she's really getting at is if there's a concerted effort to get to the root cause of the need for supportive housing. Granted, I'm sure she says that there are many root causes, but yeah, how people end up needing this type of housing. And are you seeing any particular area that's a root cause focused?
Okay. Daniel, would you like to take that one?
I'll take as many pieces as I can. Um, I mean, I think understanding the root cause of homelessness is really challenging. It's partly why our society is struggling with this. And I think I'd say it maybe another way in which I think of homelessness as like the intersection of a lot of other problems in our society. Um, so I think, in some ways we're working at it, especially on a local level. Um, And I mean, I will say I'm disheartened to see what's happening on the federal level in a lot of ways associated with homelessness right now. But I think Jeff mentioned there was a big push to work on addressing veteran homelessness. And so we did see a decrease in veteran homelessness in a big way. Now, of course, we don't live in a bubble. And so, there's people from other communities and there's a lot of complexity. And so we're still working at achieving functional zero or ending veteran homelessness. But it does give me hope and optimism that this is possible. So I think I'll start there. Jeff or Morgan, you want to take it away?
I think some of the challenge in drawing down percentages and stuff is that a lot of this stuff can be co-occurring as well. I think that can be one of the tricky parts, and especially with folks that end up at that highest level of care. It's not usually just one piece. They have multiple playing factors in it, that have gotten them to this highest level of care and the highest need for support. And so I don't personally have percentages of what that looks like, but I think that, anecdotally, we do. I mean, it's not uncommon for us to see a mixture of all of the above, right? Mental health crisis, physical health crisis, domestic violence. I'm trying to think of, like other players, but it is more often than not, it is a mixture of everything. Substance use. It can't be drawn down to just one cause. And I think that is one of the things that makes it so challenging is, we want to be able to compartmentalize it so we can come up with tangible solutions. And it's just a multifaceted solution that's ever changing. I think we saw a shift in veteran services, so we saw a downward trend in veterans experiencing homelessness. So where you see shifts, then it kind of trends. But pinpointing exactly, I don't know that there is specific.
And what I would add is coming from first half of my career working as an engineer, root cause analysis to any problem is what you look for. And you design a solution, you implement it, and off you go. And for me, I had to change my thinking when it came to permanent supportive housing, because in most cases, as Morgan just articulated, there's a lot of potential issues, and a lot of times they interact. And the best way I can put it is somebody actually gave me this example about 10 years ago. It's pretty well documented that there's a lot of mental health issues in the population we're discussing, and there's a lot of substance abuse. And if you take any one of those individuals and just ask one question, what came first? The mental health issues or the substance abuse? You can't answer it. In most cases, you don't know. And so the answers are much softer than getting to a root cause. Let's implement a fix for this person. We'll fix them and move them on their way. We'll send them to the housing authority for independent housing and move somebody else in, and we'll fix it. doesn't work that way because it's just softer. That there is no hard answer for any one individual.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions, Trish?
There are not, well, Marilyn's got her hand up here, but there are no other questions in chat, Ruth.
Okay, Marilyn, do you have a question? You need to unmute, Marilyn.
I just have a little anecdote of Red Tail Ponds. When it was first beginning, it was Michelle Christensen and Zachary Penland. And as Daniel mentioned, there was a lot of pushback. So they have neighborhood meetings and they decided people would serve on a neighborhood committee to just watch and see how it really worked. And a couple months later, they went back to this neighborhood committee and said, well, how are things going? And they said, oh, is it open yet?
Very good. Thank you, Marilyn.
Yeah, there's a
Okay.
lot of fear that doesn't materialize.
Uh-huh. I'm sure that that's often true or usually true. Okay, well, I think unless we have any other questions, we'll go ahead and close out. And I'd like to thank, first of all, the panel. Great job. Really appreciate
Thanks for
Morgan
having
and
us.
Daniel and Jeff. Yeah, thank you. I know I learned a lot tonight. And I'd also like to thank the Affordable Housing Team of the League of Women Voters of Larimer County. And I'd like to thank all of you that are participated. I hope that you got as much out of it as I did. So thank you, everyone. And next time there's another affordable housing panel, I hope that you'll all show up. We do this about once a year. So thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Hey,
Mhm.
Jeff
Thanks again
and
for funding us.
Oh,
Morgan and Jeff, could you stay on for just a minute? Would that be
Oh,
okay?
sure.